And frankly, we'll go to a member of the committee, Ms. Banning.
Thank you. I was going to say.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lincoln, UNRWA is meant to provide certain basic services to the population that it serves, such as education and health care. However, in meetings with members and staff, some UNRWA officials seem to believe that they are there to perpetuate the right of return. In your view, what is the proper role of UNRWA?
UNRWA is not there to perpetuate the right of return. If some of the individuals are from the organization are stating so, then that's not correct. Of course, there has been over time a politicization of its mandate, exactly as you have laid out. And again, this is something that has been perpetuated through the Palestinian Authority's textbooks and other means.
So what should we be doing to focus UNRWA on what its mandate is and not what its mandate should not be?
As I laid out in my testimony, I believe that a multilateral effort towards looking at the shortcomings of the United Nations with regard to this conflict in general, which includes UNRWA, is required. I think that also just on a broader sense, there are many other issues. The current iteration of the United Nations on the ground stems back from the Oslo peace process from 1993 and 1994. There are aspects of it that no longer make sense.
So let me go a step further. How would you assess UNRWA, UNESCO, the UN Human Rights Council, other agencies in terms of their fidelity to the UN's own principles of neutrality and tolerance?
I'm not familiar with all of them. We're talking about some actors on the ground, some member state bodies whose positions are defined by states, like UNESCO. So it's a little bit difficult to compare all of those together. The problem, as I mentioned, and I think that, again, we're talking about a somewhat of a systemic problem, is that in 1994, there was a division of responsibility, more or less, for the peace process. The United States was in charge of the negotiations. The European Union and others, including the United Nations, were asked by the parties and the United States to engage on the ground and support the development of Palestinian institutions and support the Palestinian people. Now, with a peace process collapsed, especially in light of the current conflict, the United Nations has the appearance less of a conflict resolution mechanism and more of an advocate, perhaps, of one side. This needs to be updated because of the situation. But again, if and when, and you hear this also from the administration on the need to reinvigorate a peace process in the wake of all of this horrible carnage that we see on the ground, you can better believe that the UN will be asked to play a role. What role that is, whether it's a circumscribed role, whether it's a greater role or not, of course, depends on a number of factors, including how the war continues and how it ends.
So there were remarks that were made by a Hamas political wing leader that were shown on TV, on the news, where he stated that it was the responsibility of Hamas to fight against Israel and to protect its fighters with their underground tunnels. And in response to questions, he said that they did not have a responsibility to allow the people, the Palestinian people, to get shelter from attacks in those tunnels, that the responsibility of the Palestinian people was solely held by the United Nations. Can you comment on that? And can you also help us understand, has there ever been a comprehensive review of the population that UNRWA serves to identify how many people actually meet the UN High Commissioner for Refugees' definition of a refugee?
Just on your last point, I'm not familiar with that aspect, and again, I should clarify for the committee, I'm not and have not ever been a staff member of UNRWA. I worked for a different part of the UN, but I will say that the comment that you mentioned from the I believe it was Musa Abu Marzouk from Hamas. This is a very common perception. Held not just by Hamas, but by Palestinian political bodies in general. And it's primarily a misunderstanding of the UN's role on the ground. Of course, there are a number of UN agencies that operate similar to how UN agencies operate anywhere in the world that support systems on the ground to provide services to the population. And in the West Bank and Gaza, you have 22 of them. UNRWA is a little bit different. And I think that, again, if we go to the heart of it, UNRWA's mode of operation and its sort of direct service model is what sets it apart, and in some ways is what is at the root of some of the issues that a wide array of donors have been concerned with for many years.
So you would agree that the comment made by that Hamas leader of the political wing is wrong, that it is the responsibility of the elected government to take care of the Palestinian people who live in Gaza?
That's correct. And of course, in a context like Gaza, and as in many other places in the world, the work of UN agencies is often conflated with the work of governments.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Schanzer, what are the best ways we can now support targeted humanitarian assistance to make sure that it gets to the people of Gaza who are actually the victims of Hamas?
It's a good question. During the war itself, what we have right now is the southern part of the Gaza Strip, which has been sort of cordoned off. The problem right now is diversion from the south to the north. And unfortunately, there's probably going to need to be some sort of military solution to destroy those tunnels so that the aid stays in the south and doesn't get diverted to Hamas in the north. I don't know how else to do it because UNRWA is not stopping it, and nor are the people on the ground. So there is a huge problem. I think I can't even tell you what the percentage is of the goods that are coming through that are being passed underground to the north, but it's a serious problem.
And does UNRWA have the ability to stop the confiscation of those goods by Hamas?
This is what we were talking about. I mean, first of all, you don't see people walking around sort of armed, right? From UNRWA, they're not there to confront anybody. That's not their job, right? Their job is to just simply provide services to the people that they deem to be qualified as Palestinian refugees, which of course has ballooned beyond any reasonable expectation. But the question really is whether UNRWA can speak out about it. And again, I mentioned this during the prepared remarks. There is a tendency among UNRWA staff to want to sweep these sorts of things under the rug in order to continue their mission. So in other words, in order to continue to provide the goods and services that they want to provide to the people of Gaza, they will pretend not to see these sorts of crimes taking place, and this makes UNRWA complicit in everything that Hamas is doing, and that is why it needs to be dismantled.
Mr. Neuer, what has the UN done to condemn Hamas and call for the release of the 240 hostages, including citizens of dozens of countries? These are not just Israelis, these are not just Americans, these are citizens of dozens of countries. What has the UN done to condemn that, to call for the release of the hostages, and frankly, to work for the release of the hostages?
Thank you, Member of Congress. I have heard a number of UN statements that have condemned Hamas's actions, but these really have been the tiny minority, and they have not had the vigor and prominence and energy that the UN's other statements on the situation have had. So there have been certain statements, but they really have been the tiny minority. The bulk of their statements, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, have been focused at pointing the finger at Israel, expressly or by implication. Certainly the UN has tremendous ability and leverage to press for the release of the hostages. The Secretary General has a bully pulpit. The other UN agencies are present on the ground in Gaza and in the territories. So they actually have enormous opportunity to speak out, to press Hamas, and it has certainly not been their priority. So one can find statements here and there, including by Dr. Tedros, but sometimes they were only in reaction when they were criticized by Israel for not having spoken out. So I certainly think UN leaders, including Guterres, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who should be in the region now, should be taking much more significant action if they've been doing anything to see that the hostages are released.
Mr. Lincoln.
No, thank you. Just to respond, although some of his statements might leave a little bit to be desired, Secretary General Guterres, I think in every single one of his statements has mentioned the hostages, not just mentioned the hostages, but called for their immediate and unconditional release. And he used the word now repeatedly in his last statement. So
and are there additional steps he could be taking?
With regard to those steps, again, the United Nations envoy, the special coordinator, the office that I used to work for, is engaged, I don't know to what degree, in the sort of broader discussions that are taking place between with the U.S. administration, Qatar, and others on the ground. But from what I understand, and again, I don't, just am getting information from press reports like everybody else. Again, the UN is playing that supporting role, but to what degree?
He hasn't put together a task force or called special meetings or emergency sessions to discuss the freeing of the hostages.
I have not heard of that, but I imagine that the U.S. is firmly in the lead on this issue right now.
Mr. Chairman, if you would indulge me for one more question. Thank you. Mr. Neuer, like many on this panel, I strongly support the Abraham Accords. In fact, we have the father of the Abraham Accord, or the father of the Abraham Accords caucus with us, one of them, with us today. And we all believe that this could be transformative for the region. Since they were signed, has there been any positive movement in terms of the voting patterns of these countries that are part of the Abraham Accords or in their approach toward Israel at the UN?
Thank you. It's a question I get often asked by different audiences, a very important question. I would say in terms of voting, the Abraham Accords countries such as Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, have for the most part not changed their voting. With one exception, a year or two ago, Bahrain was absent during a vote against Israel, and the Palestinians were upset about that, and I think summoned the Bahraini ambassador to complain about that. So that was maybe one instance. But in general, we have not seen voting changes, and these countries vote with the Arab world consistently against Israel, which is unfortunate. However, there have been a number of instances that are less than voting, but which are significant actions that have showed a change of tone. I will speak from my experience in Geneva. At least once, and I believe already twice, there have been statements made, for example, by the Deputy Ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, who took the floor at the UN in Geneva to give a statement on behalf of all the Abraham Accords countries, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, America, and Israel, a joint statement dealing with some technical matters. But that was something that, for me, was unprecedented, to see an Arab country take the floor and give a joint statement with Israel on something positive, which was a very welcome development. So there have been a few statements and other atmospherics, I would say, both in New York and Geneva, and certainly bilaterally those countries have improved their approach toward Israel in various other meetings and so forth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thank you to all of our witnesses today.